The knock on the door came at midnight, and Edmund Whitmore knew, before he opened it, that his life had already changed. Two men stood in the rain, wearing the colors of the Duke of Ashford. The taller one held a folded paper in his gloved hand, and he did not wait to be invited inside before he spoke. "The Duke requires payment of the full amount by the end of this month," he said, "or he will take the house, the land, and everything upon it." Edmund's hands trembled as he took the paper. He already knew what it said. He had known for weeks that this moment was coming, ever since he had signed his name to a debt so large that saying the number aloud made his stomach turn. He had borrowed from the Duke of Ashford to save his family from an earlier failure, and now that rescue had become a trap closing tighter every day. He closed the door slowly after the men left, and stood alone in the hallway, with the letter shaking in his hand. Upstairs, his daughter Eleanor was sleeping, unaware that the roof over her head, the food on her table, and the very name she carried could all vanish within weeks. Eleanor Whitmore was 22 years old, quick of mind, and used to noticing things others tried to hide. The next morning, she found her father sitting at the breakfast table, untouched food in front of him, his eyes fixed on nothing. "Father," she said, taking the seat across from him, "you look as though you have not slept." "I am simply tired, my dear," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, nothing more. She did not believe him, but she let it go, because pressing her father when he wished to hide something rarely worked. Instead, she turned her attention to her younger brother Henry, who was 12 and full of questions about a dog he had seen near the stables, and to her sister Margaret, who was 16 and worried more about a dress for an upcoming gathering than anything else. Eleanor managed the house the way she managed most things, quietly and efficiently, filling in the gaps her father left behind since her mother had passed 3 years earlier. But something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the servants whispered when they thought she could not hear, in the way her father flinched whenever a letter arrived, in the way he had begun locking the study door that used to stand open. She decided to watch and wait, certain that whatever storm was coming would eventually reveal itself. It did not take long. 3 days later, a carriage arrived bearing the crest of the Duke of Ashford, and Edmund left with barely a word of explanation, telling only that he had urgent business and would return soon. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the carriage disappear down the long road, a cold feeling settling into her chest that she could not explain. She spent that day distracting herself with small tasks, checking the accounts, speaking with the housekeeper, walking the garden paths that her mother once tended. But her mind kept circling back to her father's face, pale and hollow, and to the papers she had glimpsed on his desk before he left, covered in numbers too large to be anything but trouble. That evening, she asked Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper who had served the family for over a decade, if she knew anything. Mrs. Bell hesitated, wringing her apron in her hands. "It is not my place to speak of such things, Miss Eleanor." "Please," Eleanor said gently. "If something threatens this family, I would rather know than be kept in the dark." Mrs. Bell's shoulders sank. "Your father owes a great sum of money, miss, to the Duke himself. I do not know the exact figure, but I have heard enough to know it is more than this house is worth." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she stood perfectly still. "How long has this been happening?" "Since before your mother passed, I believe. It grew worse after." Eleanor thanked her, and walked outside, into the cool evening air, needing space to breathe. She thought of her father's late investments, the ones he always spoke of with confidence and excitement, promising that their fortunes would soon multiply. She had believed him, as any daughter might believe a father she loved. Now she understood that those promises had been built on borrowed money, and that borrowed money had a price far heavier than interest alone. She did not sleep well that night, turning over question after question. What did the Duke intend to do? Would he take their home? Would her father be sent away, perhaps even imprisoned for failing to repay such a debt? She had heard of such things happening to other families, ruined overnight by debts they could not settle. 2 days passed with no word from her father. On the third day, a letter arrived, written in his familiar hand but strangely formal in tone, saying only that he had been delayed at Ashford Hall and would return within the week. Eleanor read it 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning, some hint of what conversations were taking place behind those distant walls, but the words gave nothing away. She decided she could not simply wait. She spoke with Henry and Margaret, telling them only that their father had business to attend to, and that they must be patient. Henry accepted this easily, more interested in his dog than the affairs of adults, but Margaret watched Eleanor, with sharp, searching eyes. "You are hiding something," Margaret said one evening, as they sat together by the fire. "I can see it in the way you keep looking toward the window." "I am simply worried for father," Eleanor admitted. "He has been away longer than expected." "Is it about money?" Margaret asked quietly. Eleanor was surprised by the question. "Why would you think that?" "Because Mrs. Bell has not ordered new linens in months, and the cook has been serving smaller portions, and you have been going over the household accounts every single night instead of only once a week." Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "I am not a child, Eleanor. I notice things too." Eleanor reached for her sister's hand. "I do not know everything myself, Margaret, but whatever happens, I promise you, we will face it together." Margaret nodded, though worry remained etched on her young face. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her room, staring at the small portrait of her mother that hung above the fireplace. She thought of all the responsibility that had fallen onto her shoulders since her mother's passing, how she had become the quiet center holding the household together, while her father drifted further into distraction and denial. She had never resented this role, not truly, but now, she felt the weight of it pressing harder than ever before. She thought of the Duke of Ashford, a man she had never met, though she had heard his name spoken with a mixture of respect and unease throughout the county. Some said he was cold and unreachable, a man who cared only for his estate and his duties, having withdrawn from society after some private sorrow years earlier. Others said he was simply misunderstood, burdened by responsibilities too heavy for one man to carry alone. She had never given him much thought before, but now his name felt tied to her family's fate in a way she could not ignore. When her father finally returned home, a full week after he had left, Eleanor was waiting in the entrance hall the moment his carriage arrived. She searched his face for answers before he even spoke a word, and what she saw frightened her more than any letter could have. He looked older somehow, as though the days away had carved new lines into his face, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. A mixture of shame and desperate relief that did not match each other at all. "Father," she said, stepping forward, "what happened?" He glanced past her toward the stairs, as though checking that Margaret and Henry were not within hearing. "Let us speak in the study, Eleanor. There is much I must tell you, and I fear you will not receive it kindly." Her stomach tightened as she followed him down the familiar hallway, past portraits of ancestors who had never known such trouble, into the study where he had spent so many recent nights locked away in private worry. He closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit, though he himself remained standing, pacing slowly before the cold fireplace. "I must first ask your forgiveness," he began, his voice unsteady, "for the position I have placed this family in. It began with investments I believed would secure our future, ventures that promised returns far beyond what we could earn through the estate alone. I was foolish, Eleanor. I let ambition blind me to risk, and when those ventures failed, I found myself owing sums I could never hope to repay through ordinary means." "You borrowed from the Duke," Eleanor said quietly, watching his face carefully. He looked at her, startled. "You knew?" "I suspected. Mrs. Bell confirmed enough for me to understand the shape of it, though not the details." Edmund sank into his chair, defeated. "Then you understand why I traveled to Ashford Hall. I went prepared to beg for more time, to offer whatever assets remained to satisfy at least part of the debt. I expected harsh terms, perhaps even the loss of this house. What I did not expect was what the Duke actually proposed." Eleanor's heart began to pound. What did he propose? Edmund hesitated so long that Eleanor thought he might refuse to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said the debt would be forgiven entirely, every last shilling, under one condition. He paused, unable to meet her eyes. "That you agree to marry him." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Eleanor could not process what she had heard. She almost laughed, certain she had misunderstood, but her father's grave expression told her otherwise. "Marry him," she repeated slowly. "The Duke of Ashford wishes to marry me?" "That is what he proposed, yes. But he does not know me. He has never even met me." "I know. Edmund said miserably. I told him as much. I told him it was an unreasonable request, that you were not a piece of property to be traded for a debt. But he insisted the choice would be entirely yours, that he would not force the matter if you refused. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened garden without truly seeing it. Anger rose in her chest, hot and sudden, followed quickly by a wave of something closer to fear. She was being asked, in effect, to save her family, through a marriage arranged not out of affection, or even acquaintance, but out of financial necessity. It felt like something from an old story, the kind meant to teach lessons about duty and sacrifice, except this was her own life unfolding in real time. And if I refuse? She asked, without turning around. Then the debt stands, her father said quietly, and I do not know how we would survive it. The house, the land, everything we have, would likely be taken to satisfy even a portion of what is owed. Henry and Margaret would grow up with nothing, and I fear what might become of us all. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the choice pressing down upon her. She thought of her siblings, so innocent of the danger circling their home. She thought of her father's foolish choices weighing so heavily now on her own future. She thought, too, of the strange, faceless man in Ashford Hall who had offered this bargain, a man she could not begin to understand. I need time, she finally said, turning to face her father. I cannot decide something so significant in a single evening. Of course, Edmund said quickly, relief and guilt mingling in his voice. The Duke has given us until the end of the month to respond. Take whatever time you need before then. Eleanor left the study that night with more questions than answers, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never imagined having to consider. She did not sleep at all, lying awake as the candle burned low, thinking of the strange fork that had suddenly appeared in the road of her life. One path led toward the unknown, toward a marriage with a stranger whose reputation she barely understood. The other led toward almost certain ruin, dragging her entire family down with it. By morning, she had reached no decision, but she had reached one certainty. Whatever choice she made, she would make it with her eyes open, refusing to be simply a pawn moved by circumstances beyond her control. If she was to walk into this uncertain future, she would walk into it on her own terms, understanding exactly what she was choosing and why. She rose from her bed as the first light touched the horizon, dressed quietly, and walked downstairs to face whatever the coming days would bring, unaware that far across the county, in the quiet halls of Ashford, the Duke himself was equally sleepless, staring into his own uncertain future, with far more at stake than even Eleanor yet understood. Eleanor did not speak again that night, after her father finished explaining the Duke's proposal. She simply rose from her chair, walked to her room, and sat by the window for hours, watching the darkness settle over the fields she had known her entire life. Everything about her future suddenly felt uncertain, balanced on a decision she never expected to face. By morning, exhaustion had replaced her shock with a strange, clear-headed calm. She dressed quickly and went looking for her closest friend, Lucy Hartley, who lived on the neighboring estate and had known Eleanor since childhood. If anyone might know something useful about the Duke of Ashford, it would be Lucy, whose family moved often in the wider circles of county society. She found Lucy in the garden, cutting flowers for the house, and the moment Lucy saw Eleanor's face, she set down her basket and pulled her friend toward a quiet bench beneath the trees. "You look as though the sky has fallen," Lucy said. "Tell me everything." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before the whole story spilled out: the debt, the summons, the impossible proposal. Lucy listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from disbelief to something more thoughtful as the tale unfolded. "I have heard of the Duke of Ashford," Lucy said slowly once Eleanor finished, "though mostly through rumor, since he rarely attends gatherings and keeps to himself. Some say he grew cold after his younger brother died several years ago, that the loss changed him entirely. Others say he was always serious and withdrawn, even before that tragedy." "Do you think him cruel?" Eleanor asked. "I have never heard anyone accuse him of cruelty, only of distance. He is said to manage his estate well, to treat his tenants fairly, and to avoid the kind of scandal that follows many men of his rank. If anything, people find him too serious, too guarded, rather than unkind." Eleanor turned this information over in her mind, uncertain whether it comforted her or simply deepened the mystery surrounding the man who now held her family's future in his hands. He says the choice is entirely mine, that he will not force the marriage if I refuse. And do you believe him? I do not know what to believe, Eleanor admitted. I have never met him. I know only what my father has told me, and what little you have shared just now. Lucy reached for her friend's hand. Then perhaps you should meet him before deciding anything. See for yourself what kind of man he is, rather than choosing blindly based on rumor or fear. The suggestion settled something within Eleanor that had been restless since the previous night. She had been so consumed by shock and anger that she had not considered simply meeting the Duke before making any final decision. Whatever else the arrangement demanded of her, she at least deserved the chance to judge him with her own eyes. She returned home that afternoon with a clearer sense of purpose, though the underlying fear had not fully left her. She found her father in the study once more, still burdened by guilt, still avoiding her gaze whenever possible. I have decided something, she told him, and he looked up quickly, hope and dread mixing plainly on his face. I have not agreed to marry the Duke, but I will meet him before making any final choice. I want to understand what kind of man he truly is, rather than deciding based on fear alone. Relief washed visibly over her father's features. I will send word immediately. He mentioned he would welcome such a visit, should you wish it. There is something else, Eleanor added, her voice firming with a resolve that surprised even herself. If I do agree to this marriage, it will not be simply because a debt demands it. I will not walk into this arrangement as though I am a piece of property being handed over. Whatever happens, I intend to make my own choice, on my own terms, and I need you to understand that clearly before anything moves forward. Edmund nodded slowly, shame still coloring his expression. I understand, Eleanor. I have wronged you already by placing you in this position at all. Whatever you decide, I will support it, and I will never again make choices that risk your future without your knowledge. The following days passed slowly as arrangements were made for Eleanor's visit to Ashford Hall. She spent much of that time preparing herself mentally, reading what little she could find about the Ashford family history, and speaking further with Lucy, who continued gathering small details from acquaintances who moved in wider circles. She learned that the Duke's younger brother, a lively and well-liked young man named Frederick, had died in an accident nearly 4 years earlier, an event that seemed to mark a clear turning point in Alistair Vane's temperament. Before that loss, he had apparently been more open, more inclined toward society and friendship. Afterward, he withdrew almost entirely, focusing his energy solely on managing the estate and fulfilling his duties as Duke, leaving little room for anything resembling a personal life. This information gave Eleanor something to consider beyond her own fear. Perhaps the man she was about to meet carried burdens of his own, grief and responsibility weighing on him in ways she could not yet fully understand. It did not erase her anxiety about the proposed marriage, but it softened her anger slightly, replacing some of it with cautious curiosity. Margaret and Henry noticed the change in the household's atmosphere as preparations for Eleanor's journey took shape. Henry, still too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, simply asked whether Eleanor's trip meant she might bring back interesting stories about the grand house he had heard so much about. Margaret, older and more perceptive, understood enough to worry quietly, though she tried to hide it behind supportive words. You will be wonderful, Margaret told her sister the night before she was set to leave. Whatever happens, you have always known how to handle difficult situations with grace. Eleanor smiled, though nerves fluttered beneath the surface of her calm exterior. I hope you are right, Margaret. I have never faced anything quite like this before. None of us have, Margaret admitted. But I trust you to make whatever choice is right for this family, and for yourself. That night, Eleanor packed her own small trunk with careful attention, choosing her most respectable dresses, though nothing overly elaborate, since she had no wish to appear as though she were eagerly presenting herself for approval. She wanted to arrive as herself, plain and honest, rather than dressed up to impress a man whose opinion of her should matter only as much as her own judgment of him. She barely slept that night, her mind circling endlessly around questions she could not yet answer. What would he look like? What would his voice sound like? Would he treat her with the same cold formality her father described, or would some warmth show through despite his reputation for reserve? She turned these questions over and over, until exhaustion finally pulled her into restless sleep just before dawn. The morning of her departure arrived gray and quiet, mist clinging to the fields as the carriage prepared to carry her toward Ashford Hall. Her father embraced her tightly before she climbed inside, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke. "Whatever you decide, Eleanor, know that I am proud of the strength you have shown through all of this. I only wish I had never placed you in a position requiring such strength in the first place." "We cannot change what has already happened, Father," Eleanor replied gently. "We can only decide how to move forward from here." She settled into the carriage as it began its long journey, watching the familiar landscape of her childhood slowly give way to unfamiliar roads and distant hills she had never crossed before. Each mile carried her further from everything safe and known, toward a meeting that would likely determine the shape of the rest of her life. As the carriage rolled onward through the misty morning, Eleanor found herself thinking not of fear, but of a strange, steady determination settling over her. Whatever man awaited her at Ashford Hall, she intended to meet him with clear eyes and an open mind, refusing to let either fear or desperation cloud her judgment. She would listen, she would observe, and she would decide for herself what kind of future she truly wanted, regardless of what circumstances had forced upon her family. By early afternoon, the towers of Ashford Hall finally rose into view above the tree line, larger and more imposing than she had imagined from her father's description. The carriage slowed as it approached the great iron gates, and Eleanor took a steadying breath, gathering every ounce of composure she possessed, as the enormous estate drew closer with each passing moment, carrying her steadily toward the man who held her family's fate, and quite possibly her own heart, entirely in his hands. The carriage came to a halt before the great stone steps of Ashford Hall, and Eleanor sat for a moment longer than necessary, gathering her courage before stepping down into the cool afternoon air. A footman opened the door and offered his hand, and she took it with a steadiness she did not entirely feel inside. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire ground floor of her own home, its ceilings soaring high above marble floors, polished to a brilliant shine. Portraits lined the walls just as her father had described, generations of vain ancestors watching silently as she was led through the grand corridors by the same steward who had guided her father days before. She was shown into a sitting room rather than the study, a smaller and somewhat warmer space with large windows overlooking a garden far grander than the one she tended at home. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, and tea had already been prepared, waiting untouched on a low table between two chairs. She had barely settled into one of the chairs when the door opened again, and the Duke of Ashford entered. Eleanor had imagined many things about the man who would decide her family's fate, but she had not quite imagined this. Alistair Vane was tall, with dark hair slightly overlong for current fashion, and eyes that held a seriousness far beyond what she would have expected from someone still relatively young. He wore his authority naturally, without arrogance, though there was an undeniable distance in his bearing, as though he had long ago learned to hold the world slightly at arm's length. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice quiet but clear, as he took the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to this visit. I did not feel I could make any decision without first understanding the man attached to it," Eleanor replied, choosing honesty over polite pretense. Something flickered across his expression, perhaps surprise, perhaps something closer to approval. "That seems a reasonable approach. Ask me whatever you wish, Miss Whitmore. I would rather you judge me honestly than agree to anything based on false impressions." Eleanor studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Why me? You have never met me before today. Surely there are women within your own circles who would welcome such a proposal, without the complication of a family debt attached." "Perhaps," the Duke acknowledged, "but those women would come with expectations of their own, connections and obligations that would complicate matters I have no wish to complicate further. A marriage arranged through your father's debt, difficult as it may seem, offers a kind of clarity I have found lacking elsewhere." "Clarity," Eleanor repeated, unable to keep a note of skepticism from her voice. "You call trading a woman's future for forgiveness of debt clarity." The Duke's expression tightened slightly, though he did not look away from her gaze. "I understand how this arrangement must appear to you, Miss Whitmore, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. It is unusual, and perhaps unfair in ways I have not fully considered. But I promise you this much. I have no wish to trap you in a marriage built on resentment. If you agree to this arrangement, I intend to treat you with respect, and I will not demand affection you do not genuinely feel. And if I refuse, Eleanor asked directly, then I will forgive nothing, the Duke said honestly. The debt would stand, and I would be forced to pursue your family's estate as any creditor might. I take no pleasure in saying this, but I will not pretend the stakes are anything less than what they are. Eleanor appreciated, despite everything, that he did not attempt to soften this truth or disguise the pressure behind his proposal. There was something almost reassuring in his directness, even as the weight of the choice pressed heavily upon her. "May I ask you something personal?" she said after a moment. He inclined his head slightly. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer every question, but I will not refuse without reason. I have heard that you lost your brother several years ago. I am sorry for that loss, whatever role it may or may not play in your reasons for seeking this marriage." Something shifted behind the Duke's carefully controlled expression, a flicker of genuine pain quickly suppressed. "Frederick's death changed a great many things for me. I will not pretend otherwise. But I would rather not discuss the specifics today, if you do not mind. It remains a difficult subject." "I understand," Eleanor said gently, sensing she had touched something raw beneath his composed exterior. "I did not mean to cause you pain." "You have caused none," he assured her, though his voice remained quieter than before. "It is simply a wound that has not fully healed, even after this much time." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them, before Eleanor spoke again. "You said the choice would be entirely mine. I wish to understand fully what that means. If I agree, what would you expect of me as your wife?" "I would expect honesty," the Duke said without hesitation. "I would expect you to manage the household with the same competence I understand you already show in your own home. Beyond that, I would ask for patience, as I am not naturally an easy man to know, though I hope in time we might build something resembling genuine partnership between us." "And affection?" Eleanor pressed. "Would you expect that as well?" The Duke considered his answer carefully before speaking. "I would hope for it, in time, but I would never demand it, nor would I resent you should it fail to develop. I have seen enough marriages built purely on obligation to understand how hollow they can become. If we are to marry, Miss Whitmore, I would rather build something real, however long that might take, than pretend affection neither of us feels." Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved by this answer, more thoughtful and honest than she had anticipated from a man she had assumed might simply demand compliance in exchange for his mercy. It did not erase her uncertainty about the situation as a whole, but it shifted something within her perception of the man sitting across from her. They spoke for nearly an hour longer, discussing smaller matters, her family, her interests, the running of her own household in her father's frequent absences. The Duke listened carefully to each answer, asking thoughtful questions, rather than simply filling silence with idle conversation. Eleanor found herself, despite every reservation, beginning to see glimpses of a man far more complex than the cold, distant reputation Lucy had described. As the visit drew to a close and Eleanor prepared to return home, the Duke walked her to the entrance hall himself, rather than leaving the task to his steward. "I will not pressure you for an answer before you are ready, Miss Whitmore," he said as they reached the great doors. "Take whatever time remains before the deadline your father was given. Whatever you decide, know that I respect your right to choose freely, even if that choice brings consequences neither of us would prefer." "Thank you for your honesty today, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, meaning the words more sincerely than she had expected to when she first arrived. "It has given me a great deal to consider." She climbed into the waiting carriage and watched Ashford Hall shrink into the distance as they began the long journey home, her mind turning over every word exchanged during that strange, revealing conversation. She had arrived expecting either cold indifference or calculated charm, and instead had found something far more complicated, a man carrying grief and duty in equal measure, offering her an arrangement that was neither purely cruel nor purely kind, but something uncertain in between, waiting for her to decide which direction it might ultimately take. By the time the carriage reached her own gates, as evening settled over the fields, Eleanor still had no final answer, but she carried within her something she had not possessed when she left that morning, a genuine curiosity about the man whose future had suddenly become so tangled with her own, and a quiet, cautious sense that perhaps this impossible situation held more complexity, and perhaps more hope, than she had first believed possible. The days following Eleanor's visit to Ashford Hall passed in a strange, suspended quiet, as though the entire household held its breath alongside her. She spent long hours walking the familiar paths of her own garden, turning the conversation with the Duke over and over in her mind, searching for certainty that refused to arrive. Margaret noticed the shift in her sister almost immediately. "You seem different since your visit," she observed one afternoon as they sat together mending linens. "Less afraid, perhaps, though still troubled." "He was not what I expected," Eleanor admitted. "I thought I would find someone cold and indifferent, using this proposal simply to satisfy some strange whim of power. Instead, I found someone burdened by his own losses, offering something that felt almost honest, despite the strangeness of the entire arrangement." Margaret asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not know, but I think, perhaps, it is possible. He did not pretend to offer more than he could honestly give, and there was something in that honesty I found difficult to dismiss." A letter arrived from Ashford Hall 3 days later, written in a careful, measured hand that Eleanor recognized as belonging to the Duke himself rather than any secretary. She opened it alone in her room, curious despite herself at what he might have to say. The letter was brief but thoughtful, inquiring after her family's well-being, and mentioning, almost in passing, a book he thought she might enjoy, based on something she had mentioned during their conversation about her interests. He made no mention of the deadline approaching, nor any pressure regarding her eventual answer, simply extending a small, genuine gesture of consideration. Eleanor found herself smiling as she folded the letter carefully and set it aside. She wrote back that same evening, thanking him for his thoughtfulness and offering a few observations of her own about the book he had recommended, which she had actually already read some years earlier. Their correspondence, once begun, continued steadily over the following weeks, each letter revealing small pieces of two people who had begun this arrangement as strangers, but were slowly becoming something closer to acquaintances, perhaps even friends. Through these letters, Eleanor learned more about the Duke's history than she might have gathered through months of ordinary conversation. He wrote of his childhood at Ashford Hall, of a father who had been distant and demanding, and a mother who had died when he was still quite young, leaving him and his younger brother Frederick to navigate their upbringing largely under the care of tutors and stewards, rather than warm parental guidance. He wrote, too, eventually, of Frederick himself, though carefully and with visible restraint even through the written word. Frederick had been the lively one, he explained, full of laughter and mischief, in ways Alistair himself had never quite managed, drawing warmth from everyone around him effortlessly. His death, in a riding accident that Alistair still blamed himself for in ways he did not fully explain, had left a silence in Ashford Hall that nothing since had managed to fill. Eleanor responded to these confessions with gentle understanding, rather than pity, sharing in turn her own grief over her mother's passing, the way it had reshaped her role within her family, forcing her into responsibilities she had never expected to carry so young. Through this shared exchange of loss and burden, something began to shift between them, a recognition of kindred difficulty that neither had anticipated finding in the other. Her father watched this growing correspondence with cautious hope, careful not to press Eleanor toward any particular decision, though the deadline continued approaching steadily with each passing week. He had learned, through the painful lessons of recent months, not to interfere further in matters that were rightfully his daughter's to decide. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her initial visit, another letter arrived from Ashford Hall, this one requesting a second visit, should Eleanor be willing. The Duke wrote that he understood if she preferred to make her decision through correspondence alone, but that he would welcome the chance to speak with her again in person, without any pressure attached beyond simple conversation. Eleanor agreed readily this time, curious to see whether the man she had glimpsed through careful, considered letters matched the man she would find in person once more. The second visit felt markedly different from the first. Gone was the careful formality that had marked their initial meeting, replaced instead by an easier, more natural exchange between two people who had already shared more of themselves through written correspondence than most acquaintances managed in months of ordinary conversation. They walked together through the gardens of Ashford Hall this time, rather than remaining confined to the sitting room. and Eleanor found the Duke surprisingly knowledgeable about the various plants and flowers surrounding them. A passion, he confessed, had grown from spending long hours in these same gardens as a child, seeking refuge from a household that had often felt more like a formal institution than a home. "I have not walked these paths with anyone in a long time," he admitted, as they paused beside a small fountain near the center of the garden. "Since Frederick, actually. He used to accompany me here often, before everything changed." "I am glad you shared them with me today," Eleanor said sincerely. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something softer than she had seen before flickering across his usually guarded expression. "I find myself glad as well, Miss Whitmore. More glad than I expected to be, given how this arrangement began." They continued walking, discussing matters both trivial and significant: the running of estates, the responsibilities of managing households and tenants, small observations about books and ideas that revealed shared sensibilities neither had fully anticipated finding in the other. Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely at a dry observation the Duke made about a particularly demanding neighbor, surprised by how easily humor emerged from a man she had initially assumed incapable of such lightness. "You seem surprised that I can laugh," he observed, catching her expression. "I confess I expected someone far more severe," Eleanor admitted honestly. "The reputation that precedes you paints a rather different picture than the man I am coming to know." "Perhaps reputation rarely captures the full truth of anyone," the Duke replied thoughtfully. "I have certainly become more guarded since Frederick's death, more focused on duty than personal enjoyment, but I have not forgotten entirely how to find lightness in life, even if I rarely allow myself the indulgence these days." Before she departed that afternoon, the Duke walked her once more to the entrance hall, though this time his manner carried a warmth entirely absent during their first meeting weeks earlier. "The deadline approaches soon," he said quietly, as they reached the doors. "I do not wish to pressure you, but I felt it only fair to acknowledge it remains present in both our minds." "I am aware," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I find myself, strangely, no longer viewing this decision purely through the lens of obligation or fear. Whatever I decide, it will be based on something more genuine than simple necessity." "That is all I could ask for," the Duke replied, something like hope flickering briefly in his careful expression before he composed himself once more. "Travel safely home, Miss Whitmore. I look forward to whatever answer you ultimately bring." The carriage ride home that evening felt different from her first journey to Ashford Hall weeks before. Where once she had traveled with dread and uncertainty weighing heavily upon her, she now carried something closer to quiet anticipation, a recognition that whatever choice awaited her, it would not simply be a sacrifice made under duress, but potentially the beginning of something genuinely worth choosing. Yet doubt remained, stubborn and persistent beneath her growing warmth toward the Duke. She thought of her family's desperate circumstances, of the debt still hanging over their heads regardless of any personal feelings developing between herself and Alistair Vane. Could she ever fully trust that her growing affection was genuine, rather than simply gratitude wrapped in the desperate hope of rescue? The question followed her home, through the darkening countryside, unresolved even as the deadline continued drawing steadily closer with each passing day. The final week before the deadline arrived faster than Eleanor expected, each day carrying its own quiet weight as she moved through familiar routines, while her mind remained fixed on the decision still awaiting her. She had spoken with her father, with Margaret, even briefly with Henry, though he remained largely unaware of the true significance behind the choice his sister faced. It was Lucy, however, who finally helped her articulate what had been building steadily within her over the past weeks of correspondence and conversation. "You speak of him differently now," Lucy observed one afternoon as they sat together in the garden, the same bench where Eleanor had first confided the entire situation weeks earlier. "When you first told me of this proposal, your voice carried only fear and anger. Now, when you speak of the Duke, I hear something else entirely." "I do not know what I feel exactly," Eleanor admitted. "Respect, certainly, perhaps something warmer, beginning to grow alongside it. But I fear constantly that whatever I feel is simply gratitude disguised as affection, given how this entire arrangement began." "Does it matter how something begins?" Lucy asked gently, "if what grows from it proves genuine in the end? Many marriages begin through far less thoughtful arrangements than yours, built purely on family alliance or financial convenience, without any of the honest conversation you have shared with this man these past weeks. Eleanor considered this carefully. You believe I should accept then? I believe you should trust what you have actually experienced, rather than doubting it simply because the circumstances surrounding it remain complicated. You told me yourself that he has been honest with you at every turn, that he has never pressured you beyond what circumstances already demanded. That honesty alone sets this apart from simple obligation. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her room, long after the household had settled into sleep, reviewing every letter the Duke had sent her, every conversation shared during her 2 visits to Ashford Hall. She thought of his quiet grief over Frederick, carefully guarded but genuine. She thought of his surprising laughter in the garden. The warmth that had emerged once formal distance gave way to easier familiarity. She thought, too, of her family's circumstances, the debt still threatening everything she held dear, and found that these considerations no longer felt separate from her growing feelings toward the Duke himself, but rather intertwined with them, in ways that felt increasingly natural rather than forced. She rose the next morning with unusual clarity, dressed quickly, and sought out her father before he had even finished his breakfast. I have decided, she said simply, and watched him set down his cup carefully, bracing himself for whatever answer she was about to deliver. I will marry the Duke of Ashford, Eleanor continued. But I want to be clear about something, Father. I am not agreeing simply to save this family from ruin, though that certainly weighs upon my decision. I am agreeing because I have come to believe, through these past weeks of conversation and correspondence, that this marriage might genuinely become something worth choosing, regardless of the debt that first brought us together. Relief and pride mingled visibly on her father's face. I am glad, Eleanor, more glad than I can properly express, both for what this means for our family's future, and for what it might mean for your own happiness. There is something else, Eleanor added firmly. I will write to the Duke myself, delivering my answer directly, rather than through you. Whatever partnership develops between us should begin with my own voice, not filtered through anyone else's mediation. Edmund nodded, understanding the importance of this request without needing further explanation. Of course, Eleanor. This decision belongs entirely to you, and so should its delivery. That afternoon, Eleanor sat at her writing desk for nearly an hour before finally composing a letter that felt honest enough to send. She wrote of her initial fear and anger upon first learning of the proposal, admitting these feelings openly, rather than pretending they had never existed. She wrote, too, of how their subsequent correspondence and conversations had gradually shifted her perspective, revealing a man far more complex and genuine than she had initially expected. She accepted his proposal, she wrote, not simply out of obligation to her family, though she would not pretend that consideration held no weight, but because she had come to believe that something real might grow between them, given time and continued honesty. She asked only that they continue building their understanding of each other with the same careful openness that had characterized their correspondence thus far, rather than allowing the formal requirements of marriage to replace genuine connection with empty duty. She sealed the letter and sent it that same evening, watching the messenger disappear down the road toward Ashford Hall, with a strange mixture of relief and nervous anticipation settling over her. The Duke's response arrived only 2 days later, delivered personally, rather than through any intermediary, as the Duke himself traveled to Whitmore Manor for the first time since this entire arrangement began. Eleanor was in the garden when his carriage arrived, and she watched with quickening heartbeat as he stepped down and approached her directly, bypassing the formal entrance entirely, in favor of finding her himself. Miss Whitmore, he said, stopping a respectful distance away, though something urgent and genuine animated his usually composed features. I received your letter, and I felt compelled to respond in person, rather than through written word alone. I hope my answer pleased you, Your Grace, Eleanor said, though nervousness colored her voice, despite her best efforts at composure. More than pleased me, the Duke replied, closing the distance between them slightly. Your honesty, both in acknowledging your initial fear and in expressing what has grown since, means a great deal to me. I did not expect, when I first proposed this arrangement, to find myself genuinely hoping for more than simple obligation between us. Yet here I am, hoping precisely that. Eleanor felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, genuine, and unguarded in a way she had not witnessed even during their most open conversations at Ashford Hall. "I feel the same, Your Grace. Whatever uncertainty remains about our future, I find myself genuinely looking forward to discovering it alongside you, rather than simply enduring it as obligation demands." They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, the weight of everything that had brought them to this point settling comfortably between them, rather than pressing down as burden alone. Plans would need to be made, arrangements finalized, a wedding organized within proper time, despite the unusual circumstances that had first brought them together. But for this moment, standing together in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor felt something she had not expected to feel when this entire situation began weeks earlier. A quiet, genuine hope for the future, unfolding steadily before them both. News of the engagement between Eleanor Whitmore and the Duke of Ashford spread through county society faster than either of them anticipated, carried from household to household through the kind of eager gossip that thrived on any hint of scandal or surprise among the wealthy and titled families of the region. Eleanor first felt the weight of this attention during a visit to the local market town, where she had gone with Margaret to purchase fabric for wedding preparations. Women she barely recognized offered pointed smiles and whispered comments as they passed, their words carrying just far enough for Eleanor to catch fragments of speculation about fortune hunters and desperate arrangements. "Pay them no mind," Margaret said firmly, though her own cheeks had flushed at the whispered comments. "They know nothing of what has actually happened between you and the Duke." "They know enough to construct their own version of events," Eleanor replied, forcing calm into her voice, despite the discomfort settling in her stomach. A baron's daughter, marrying a duke so suddenly, with no prior acquaintance between families. Of course tongues will wag. The gossip only intensified as the wedding date approached, with some whispering that Eleanor had somehow trapped the Duke through calculated scheming, while others suggested the opposite, that the Duke had taken cruel advantage of a family's desperate circumstances to secure a bride without proper courtship. Neither version approached the actual truth of careful correspondence and gradually developing genuine affection, but truth rarely satisfied appetite for scandal among those with idle time and eager imaginations. Lucy did her best to counter the worst of these rumors within their own social circle, speaking whenever possible of Eleanor's genuine character and the careful consideration she had clearly given the entire situation. But rumors, once established, proved difficult to fully dispel, regardless of how many people spoke reasonably against them. The Duke faced similar scrutiny within his own circles, though he seemed far more accustomed to weathering such attention than Eleanor. When she mentioned the whispered comments during one of their continued visits, he simply shook his head with weary familiarity. "Society has speculated about my affairs since Frederick's death," he told her, as they walked once more through the Ashford Gardens, autumn now settling colorfully over the grounds. "They speculated about my grief, about my withdrawal from society, about whether I intended to marry at all, given how long I remained unattached. This new speculation is simply another chapter in a story they have been constructing about me for years, regardless of what actual truth might say otherwise." "Does it not trouble you?" Eleanor asked. "It troubled me greatly, once," he admitted. "I spent considerable energy, after Frederick's death, trying to correct false impressions people held about my grief, about my supposed coldness toward the world. Eventually, I learned that such efforts accomplished little beyond exhausting myself further. Those who truly know me understand the truth. Those who prefer speculation will continue speculating, regardless of what evidence contradicts their assumptions." Eleanor found some comfort in his perspective, though she could not entirely shake her own discomfort at being discussed so freely by strangers who understood nothing of the genuine connection developing between herself and the Duke. She resolved, however, to follow his example as best she could, focusing her energy on the relationship actually forming, rather than the false narratives circulating beyond her control. One particular source of tension arose when Charles Pemberton, a young gentleman who had once shown clear interest in courting Eleanor before her family's financial troubles became widely known, appeared uninvited at a small gathering hosted by Lucy's family, ostensibly to offer congratulations on the engagement. "I must say, Miss Whitmore," Charles said, his tone carrying an edge of insincerity beneath its polite surface, "this match seems rather sudden, given how little acquaintance you and the Duke shared before this engagement was announced." One wonders what circumstances might have accelerated matters so significantly. Eleanor felt her composure tighten at the implied accusation beneath his words. Circumstances vary for every match, Mr. Pemberton. I do not believe the speed of an engagement necessarily reflects upon its genuine foundation. Of course not, Charles replied smoothly, though his smile did not reach his eyes. I simply recall a time when you seemed to value more traditional courtship, before your family's difficulties became known throughout the county. It is curious how circumstances can shift one's priorities so entirely. Lucy, overhearing this exchange, moved quickly to intervene. Charles, I believe you were just telling me about your recent travels to the northern counties. Do share more of that story, rather than dwelling on matters that concern only Eleanor and the Duke. Charles accepted the redirection with visible reluctance, though he cast one final, pointed glance toward Eleanor, before allowing Lucy to steer the conversation elsewhere. Eleanor remained troubled by the exchange long after the gathering ended, uncertain whether Charles's comments stemmed from genuine concern, wounded pride at her earlier rejection of his attentions, or something more calculated that she could not yet identify. She mentioned the encounter to the Duke during her next visit, watching his expression carefully, as she recounted Charles's pointed remarks. Pemberton, the Duke said thoughtfully, his tone carrying something more complicated than simple dismissal. I have encountered him briefly within certain circles. He struck me as a man more concerned with appearances and advantage than genuine character, though I confess, I know little beyond passing impression. He seemed almost bitter, Eleanor observed, as though our engagement offended him personally, rather than simply surprising him as gossip might. The Duke's expression grew more serious. Perhaps he harbored genuine feelings toward you before circumstances shifted. Wounded pride can make even reasonable men behave with unexpected pettiness. I never encouraged his attentions, Eleanor said quickly, wanting to be clear on this point. There was brief acquaintance between us, nothing more, before my family's difficulties became widely known. I would not wish you to think otherwise. I do not doubt your account, Eleanor, the Duke assured her, using her given name for the first time since their acquaintance began, a small but significant shift that did not escape her notice. I only mention it because such wounded feelings, however unjustified, sometimes manifest in troublesome ways. I would ask that you inform me should Pemberton's behavior become anything beyond simple social awkwardness. Eleanor agreed, though she hoped privately that the encounter had been nothing more than an isolated incident of petty jealousy, soon forgotten as the wedding approached and society's attention inevitably shifted toward newer sources of gossip and speculation. Yet something about Charles Pemberton's pointed comments lingered uncomfortably in her memory, a small shadow cast across otherwise growing happiness that she could not quite shake entirely from her thoughts, as preparations for her upcoming marriage continued steadily forward. As autumn deepened and the wedding date drew steadily nearer, Eleanor found herself visiting Ashford Hall with increasing frequency, each meeting revealing new layers of the man she was preparing to marry. What had begun as careful, guarded conversation had gradually transformed into something far more comfortable, the kind of easy familiarity that came from genuine trust rather than simple obligation. During one such visit, as they sat together in the library reviewing wedding arrangements, Eleanor noticed the Duke's aunt, Lady Constance, observing them from a nearby chair, with keen, assessing eyes. Lady Constance had taken up residence at Ashford Hall following Frederick's death, ostensibly to support her grieving nephew, though Eleanor had quickly gathered that the elderly woman possessed opinions on nearly every matter concerning the estate and its future. You seem surprised by how quickly this match has progressed, Lady Constance, Eleanor observed carefully, noticing the woman's continued scrutiny. I am simply relieved, Lady Constance replied bluntly, setting down her needlework. My nephew has carried the full weight of this family's future upon his shoulders alone, for far too long. An heir has been needed for years now, and Alistair has shown no inclination whatsoever toward securing one through ordinary courtship. Eleanor glanced toward the Duke, curious how he might respond to his aunt's frank assessment, and found him looking slightly uncomfortable, though he did not contradict her words. Lady Constance speaks the truth, though perhaps with less delicacy than the matter deserves, he admitted once his aunt had returned to her needlework. Part of my reasoning behind this proposal, beyond what genuine feeling has since developed between us, involved practical necessity. Ashford requires an heir, and I had shown little inclination toward pursuing marriage through conventional means since Frederick's passing. "You never mentioned this consideration before," Eleanor said, though not with accusation, simply genuine curiosity. "I did not wish you to feel as though you were being valued solely for that purpose," the Duke explained carefully. "The debt provided circumstance, certainly, but my interest in you specifically grew from something far more personal than simple practical necessity. I wanted you to understand that distinction clearly, which is perhaps why I hesitated to mention Lady Constance's more blunt concerns until now." Eleanor appreciated this honesty, understanding that practical considerations naturally accompanied any marriage among families of standing, regardless of whatever genuine affection might also develop. She had never expected romance alone to justify such a significant arrangement, and the Duke's careful attention to ensuring she understood the full complexity of his reasoning only deepened her trust in his overall honesty. Later that same visit, as they walked once more through the gardens now turning golden and red with the changing season, the Duke shared something he had not yet fully explained regarding Frederick's death. "I have told you that I blame myself for what happened," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, rather than meeting her eyes directly. "I have never fully explained why, though perhaps you deserve to understand before we marry." Eleanor remained silent, sensing he needed space to continue at his own pace, rather than being pressed toward explanation. "Frederick wished to purchase a particular horse, spirited and difficult to manage, against my explicit advice," the Duke continued. "I argued against it strongly, believing the animal too dangerous for someone of his relatively limited experience with such temperamental creatures. He purchased it regardless, perhaps partly to prove me wrong, and was thrown during what should have been a simple ride only weeks later. He died 3 days after the accident, having never regained full consciousness. That was not your fault," Eleanor said gently. "You warned him. The choice to proceed regardless was entirely his own." "I know this, intellectually," the Duke replied, his voice carrying old, familiar pain. "Yet I cannot fully release the belief that had I argued more forcefully, had I somehow found the right words to convince him otherwise, he might still be here today. Grief rarely responds entirely to reason, however sound that reason might be." Eleanor reached for his hand, a small gesture of comfort that felt entirely natural, despite the relative newness of their physical familiarity. Grief asks difficult questions that reason alone cannot always answer. I understand something of this myself, from losing my mother. I spent considerable time wondering whether different choices, different attention paid to her declining health, might have somehow changed the outcome, though ultimately, I understood such thoughts brought only additional pain, without altering anything that had already occurred. The Duke turned to look at her then, something raw and grateful passing across his expression. "You understand this in ways few others have managed, Eleanor. I have carried this particular grief, largely alone since Frederick's passing, uncertain how to share it, without appearing weak or overly sentimental, to those who expected only stoic duty from the new Duke of Ashford. You need not carry such burdens alone any longer," Eleanor said softly. "Whatever partnership we build together, I hope it includes space for exactly this kind of honesty, rather than requiring either of us to hide our genuine feelings behind proper appearances." They stood together, beside the same fountain, where he had first mentioned walking these paths with Frederick, the autumn light casting long shadows across the garden, as the conversation settled into comfortable silence between them. Eleanor felt, in that moment, a deep certainty that whatever challenges still awaited their marriage, the foundation being built between them through such honest exchange, would prove strong enough to weather difficulty when it inevitably arrived. That evening, as her carriage carried her home once more through the darkening countryside, Eleanor reflected on how far her understanding of the Duke had traveled since that first shocking revelation of his proposal weeks earlier. She no longer saw him as the distant, calculating figure she had initially feared, nor simply as a means of rescuing her family from financial ruin. She saw him now as a genuinely complex man, carrying grief and duty with quiet dignity, offering her something increasingly real beneath the practical circumstances that had first brought them together. Yet even as this growing trust settled comfortably within her, she remained unaware that Charles Pemberton's wounded pride had not simply faded following their brief encounter at Lucy's gathering, but had instead begun quietly gathering into something far more troublesome, a shadow steadily approaching, that would soon test everything Eleanor and the Duke had carefully built between them. The trouble arrived without warning, as trouble often does, in the form of a letter delivered to Edmund Whitmore rather than to Eleanor herself. The letter bore no signature, though something about its careful, deliberate handwriting struck Edmund as familiar, though he could not immediately place where he had encountered it before. The letter claimed, in careful and calculated language, that the Duke of Ashford harbored a secret from his past that would surely end the engagement should it become widely known, suggesting that Frederick's death had not been the simple accident everyone believed, but something far more troubling that the Duke had worked hard to conceal from public knowledge. Edmund brought the letter immediately to Eleanor, his hands shaking as he passed it to her. "I do not know who sent this, or whether any of it holds truth, but I felt you deserved to see it before deciding how to proceed." Eleanor read the letter twice, her stomach tightening with each careful, insinuating phrase. The letter did not state outright accusations, but rather implied darkly that the Duke's guilt over Frederick's death ran deeper than simple grief, suggesting some manner of negligence, or worse, that had never been properly investigated at the time. "This is clearly meant to frighten us," Eleanor said, though her voice betrayed some of the unease settling within her despite her attempt at composure. "Whoever wrote this offers no actual evidence, only suggestion and insinuation." "Do you believe it holds any truth?" Edmund asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not know. The Duke has spoken to me honestly about his guilt regarding Frederick's death, but he described an accident resulting from his brother's own choices, nothing suggesting deliberate harm or concealment. I find it difficult to reconcile the man I have come to know with whatever darker implication this letter suggests." Yet despite her measured response, doubt crept insidiously into her thoughts over the following days. She found herself reviewing every conversation she had shared with the Duke regarding Frederick, searching for any inconsistency that might support the letter's troubling implications. She hated herself slightly for this doubt, yet could not fully banish it once planted. She confided in Lucy immediately, showing her friend the anonymous letter and watching her reaction carefully. "This smells of Pemberton's petty spite," Lucy said immediately, her expression hardening with recognition. "I have seen his handwriting before, on invitations and correspondence within our social circle. This looks remarkably similar, though disguised somewhat through careful, deliberate strokes." "You believe Charles wrote this?" Eleanor asked, startled by her friend's certainty. "I cannot prove it outright," Lucy admitted, "but his behavior at my family's gathering, combined with this timing, suggests someone determined to disrupt your engagement through whatever means available. Whether from wounded pride or genuine malice, I would not put such a scheme beyond him." Eleanor felt anger replacing some of her earlier doubt, though uncertainty remained regarding how to properly address such an anonymous accusation. She decided, ultimately, that honesty offered the only reasonable path forward, and she traveled to Ashford Hall the following day, letter in hand, determined to discuss the matter directly with the Duke, rather than allowing doubt to fester unspoken between them. The Duke's reaction upon reading the letter proved immediate and visceral, his composed exterior cracking briefly to reveal genuine anger and pain beneath. "This is a lie," he said firmly, though his hands trembled slightly as he set the letter aside. "Whoever wrote this knows nothing of what actually occurred, and has chosen instead to twist genuine tragedy into something calculated for their own purposes." "I did not believe it fully," Eleanor said quickly, wanting to reassure him despite the doubt that had briefly crept into her own thoughts. "But I felt you deserved to know such accusations were circulating, rather than allowing them to spread unchallenged behind your back." "Thank you for bringing this to me directly," the Duke said, some of his composure returning, though tension remained visible in his tightened jaw. "I can only imagine who might have crafted such a cruel fabrication, though I have my suspicions given recent circumstances." "Charles Pemberton," Eleanor said quietly, watching for his reaction. The Duke's expression darkened further. "I suspected as much, given his behavior at your friend's gathering. Wounded pride, it seems, can drive even reasonable men toward genuinely cruel actions when properly provoked." "What actually happened that day, with Frederick?" Eleanor asked gently, wanting to hear the full account directly from him, rather than relying solely on fragments shared during earlier, more guarded conversations. The Duke was quiet for a long moment before answering, clearly gathering the strength required to revisit such painful memory in full detail. Frederick rode out alone that morning, against my explicit wishes, taking the horse I had warned him repeatedly against purchasing. I discovered his absence only when he failed to return by midday, and organized a search immediately upon realizing something had gone wrong. We found him nearly 2 hours later, already unconscious from his fall, having likely lain injured for some considerable time before we located him. "There was no negligence on your part," Eleanor said firmly. "You warned him against the purchase, and organized help the moment you realized trouble had occurred. I know this, and yet the guilt remains regardless," the Duke admitted. "Whoever crafted this letter clearly seeks to exploit that lingering guilt, twisting genuine tragedy into implied wrongdoing where none actually existed." Eleanor reached for his hand, offering what comfort she could, despite the troubling circumstances that had brought them to this difficult conversation. "We must address this directly, rather than allowing such accusations to spread unchallenged. Whoever wrote this letter clearly hoped to create exactly this kind of doubt and division between us." "Agreed," the Duke said, some of his earlier composure returning alongside quiet determination. "I will investigate who sent this letter and address whatever consequences follow accordingly. In the meantime, I would ask that you trust what you already know of me, rather than allowing anonymous cruelty to plant doubt where none should exist." "I trust you," Eleanor said, meaning the words genuinely, despite the brief uncertainty that had troubled her over recent days. "Whatever schemes someone hopes to enact against our engagement, I do not intend to let them succeed." Yet even as she spoke these confident words, Eleanor could not entirely shake a nagging unease, aware that whoever had crafted this cruel letter likely would not abandon their efforts so easily, and that further trouble might well be waiting to test the foundation they had worked so carefully to build together over these recent weeks of honest, growing trust. The following week brought matters to a head in a manner none of them had fully anticipated. A second letter arrived, this time delivered not to Edmund, but directly to several prominent families throughout the county, repeating the same troubling insinuations about Frederick's death, while adding new, more specific claims that suggested actual documentation existed, proving the Duke's negligence had been deliberately concealed from official inquiry. Lucy arrived at Whitmore Manor early that morning, breathless from having ridden over the moment she learned of the letter's wider distribution. "This has gone beyond simple gossip now, Eleanor. Several families have already begun questioning whether they should attend the wedding at all, given such serious accusations circulating so publicly." Eleanor felt genuine fear settling into her chest for the first time since this entire situation began. "We must resolve this quickly, before it spreads further and does lasting damage to the Duke's reputation, regardless of whatever truth actually exists." She traveled immediately to Ashford Hall, finding the Duke already deep in conversation with his steward and Lady Constance regarding how best to address the growing crisis. His expression, when he turned to greet her, carried visible strain beneath his usual composed exterior. "The situation has escalated considerably," he said without preamble. "I have identified the source of these letters through careful investigation. Charles Pemberton indeed authored both letters, motivated by wounded pride following your rejection of his earlier attentions, combined with jealousy over my successful engagement to you." "How can you prove this?" Eleanor asked. "My steward recognized his handwriting from correspondence exchanged years ago regarding a minor property dispute between our families," the Duke explained. "Beyond this, I have learned that Pemberton has been quietly indebted himself and likely hoped that disrupting our engagement might create opportunity for himself, whether through securing your hand once mine was rejected, or through some other advantage I have not yet fully uncovered." "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked, though determination had already begun replacing her earlier fear. "We confront this directly," the Duke said firmly. "I intend to gather the families who received these letters and address the accusations openly, providing whatever evidence necessary to demonstrate their falseness. I have already sent word requesting the official report filed at the time of Frederick's death, which will confirm precisely what I have already told you regarding the circumstances of that tragedy." 3 days later, a gathering was arranged at Ashford Hall itself, bringing together the prominent families who had received Pemberton's cruel letters, alongside Eleanor's own family and closest friends. The Duke stood before this assembled group, with quiet, controlled dignity. Eleanor standing beside him, rather than watching from a distance, determined to demonstrate her unwavering support publicly. I understand that troubling letters have circulated recently, suggesting negligence and concealment regarding my brother Frederick's death several years ago, the Duke began, his voice steady, despite the difficult subject matter. I wish to address these accusations directly and completely, rather than allowing anonymous cruelty to continue spreading unchallenged. He proceeded to share the official report from Frederick's death, confirming every detail he had already shared privately with Eleanor, the warning against the dangerous horse, Frederick's independent decision to proceed regardless, the immediate search organized upon discovering his absence. The assembled guests listened in careful silence, several exchanging glances that suggested growing understanding of how thoroughly they had been misled by anonymous accusation. As for who authored these cruel and baseless letters, the Duke continued, his gaze finding Charles Pemberton among the assembled guests, whose face had grown increasingly pale as the presentation continued. I have determined through careful investigation that Mr. Charles Pemberton crafted both letters, motivated by personal grievance rather than any genuine concern for truth or justice. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd as attention shifted toward Charles, whose composure had entirely crumbled beneath the weight of public exposure. He attempted weak denial, though his stammering response convinced no one present, particularly once Lucy stepped forward to confirm recognizing his handwriting from the letters themselves. I believed, Charles finally admitted, his voice barely audible in the tense silence that had fallen over the room, that Miss Whitmore deserved better than an arrangement built on financial necessity rather than genuine affection. I never intended such serious accusations to spread as widely as they eventually did. Whatever your intentions, the Duke replied coldly, you have caused genuine harm through deliberate falsehood, damaging reputations, and nearly destroying trust that took considerable time and honesty to build. I expect you to understand the seriousness of what you have done, and the consequences that will rightfully follow such deliberate cruelty. Charles left the gathering shortly after, his social standing considerably diminished by such public exposure, while the assembled families offered sincere apologies to both Eleanor and the Duke for having entertained such baseless accusations even briefly. Once the gathering dispersed, and only close family remained, Eleanor finally allowed herself to fully process everything that had transpired over recent days. She found the Duke alone in his study afterward, the strain of the difficult confrontation still visible in his tired expression. You handled that with remarkable composure, she said gently, moving to sit beside him. I could not have managed it without your support standing beside me throughout, he replied honestly. Your presence there, unwavering despite everything Pemberton attempted to plant between us, meant more than I can properly express. I never doubted you, Eleanor said, though she admitted silently to herself the brief uncertainty that had troubled her upon first receiving that anonymous letter. Whatever schemes others attempt against us, I trust what I have come to know of your genuine character through these recent months. The Duke reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. This entire ordeal has only strengthened my certainty regarding our future together, Eleanor. Whatever challenges arise, I believe we have proven capable of facing them honestly, together, rather than allowing doubt or fear to divide us. Eleanor smiled, genuine warmth replacing the fear and uncertainty that had troubled her over recent days. Then let us move forward, toward our wedding with confidence, rather than allowing anyone's cruel schemes to overshadow what we have genuinely built together. As evening settled over Ashford Hall, the difficult crisis finally resolved through honest confrontation and unwavering mutual support. Eleanor felt more certain than ever that whatever future awaited her as the Duke's wife, it would be built upon a foundation strong enough to weather whatever additional challenges life might eventually bring their way. The weeks following the confrontation at Ashford Hall passed with a lightness Eleanor had not felt since the entire arrangement first began months earlier. Whatever lingering doubt Charles Pemberton's cruel scheme had attempted to plant between herself and the Duke had instead served only to strengthen their bond, proving through genuine crisis that the trust they had built together could withstand far more than simple gossip or petty malice. Wedding preparations resumed with renewed energy, no longer shadowed by anonymous accusation or public scrutiny, but instead carried forward by genuine anticipation from both families involved. Margaret and Henry threw themselves eagerly into whatever small tasks Eleanor allowed them to help with, while Edmund watched his daughter's growing happiness with quiet, grateful relief that had replaced his earlier guilt almost entirely. "I never imagined, when this all began, that it might lead to something so genuinely good," Edmund admitted one evening, as he and Eleanor reviewed final wedding arrangements together. "I carry guilt still, for the position my own poor choices placed you in, but I find myself increasingly grateful for how everything has ultimately unfolded." "We cannot always predict how difficult circumstances might eventually transform, Father," Eleanor replied gently. "What matters now is the genuine happiness I have found, rather than dwelling further on how that happiness first came to be." Lady Constance, too, had grown considerably warmer toward Eleanor as the wedding approached, her earlier blunt assessment of practical necessity giving way to genuine fondness, as she witnessed the authentic connection developing between her nephew and his intended bride. "I confess I worried, initially, that this arrangement might produce nothing beyond cold, dutiful partnership," Lady Constance admitted during one of Eleanor's final visits before the wedding itself. "I am pleased to see how thoroughly mistaken that early worry has proven. Alistair has not seemed this genuinely content since long before Frederick's passing. He has given me equal reason for genuine happiness," Eleanor replied warmly. "Whatever circumstances first brought us together, I believe we have built something worth far more than simple obligation between us." The wedding day itself arrived on a clear, bright morning in early winter, the kind of crisp, beautiful day that seemed almost designed to celebrate new beginnings. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, with Margaret's enthusiastic assistance, both sisters laughing together over small details as nervous excitement filled the household. "You look truly beautiful," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her sister's appearance once the final preparations were complete. "I am so genuinely happy for you, Eleanor, after everything you have faced these past months." "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor replied, embracing her sister carefully to avoid disturbing her carefully arranged dress. "Whatever challenges brought us to this moment, I could not imagine a more fitting way to begin this new chapter of my life." The ceremony itself took place at the small chapel near Ashford Hall, filled with family and friends who had gathered to witness this union that had begun under such unusual circumstances, but had ultimately grown into something genuinely worth celebrating. Eleanor walked down the aisle beside her father, who could not fully hide the emotion visible in his proud, grateful expression. The Duke waited for her at the altar, his usually composed expression softened by genuine emotion as he watched her approach. When she finally reached him, he took her hand gently, his voice carrying quiet sincerity as the ceremony began. "I stand here today," the Duke said during his vows, departing slightly from traditional formal language to speak more personally, "not because circumstance first brought us together, but because I have genuinely come to cherish the woman standing beside me. Eleanor has shown me, through these recent months, what genuine partnership built on honesty and mutual respect can truly become. I promise to honor that foundation for the rest of our lives together." Eleanor felt tears gathering as she offered her own vows in return, expressing similar sentiment regarding how thoroughly her initial fear and uncertainty had transformed into genuine affection and respect for the man now becoming her husband. "Whatever unusual path brought us to this moment," she said, "I could not imagine choosing any differently, given everything I have learned about your genuine character these past months. I promise to build alongside you a partnership founded on the same honesty that has guided us thus far." The ceremony concluded with genuine celebration, rather than mere formal obligation. Guests offering sincere congratulations, rather than the whispered speculation that had once surrounded their engagement. Charles Pemberton, having faced considerable social consequence following his exposed scheme, was notably absent from the celebration, his earlier attempt at disruption having ultimately failed to achieve anything beyond his own diminished standing among those who valued honesty and genuine character. As the celebration continued into the evening, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with her new husband, stepping away briefly from the festivities to appreciate the significance of everything that had unfolded since that first frightening letter arrived at her father's door months earlier. "Do you regret how this began?" the Duke asked quietly, watching her carefully as they stood together beneath the clear winter sky. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the fear and uncertainty those early days brought. Certainly. but I cannot regret where that difficult beginning ultimately led us. Had circumstances unfolded differently, we might never have found each other at all, never discovered the genuine partnership we have built together through such careful, honest conversation these past months. I feel precisely the same, the Duke admitted, drawing her closer. Whatever unusual path brought us together, I find myself deeply grateful for every difficult step that ultimately led to this moment. Standing here together, as genuine partners, rather than simply parties, bound by financial necessity. They returned to the celebration together, greeting guests, and accepting warm congratulations from families who had once questioned the very legitimacy of their union, but now recognized the genuine happiness clearly evident between them. Margaret and Henry danced together nearby, their earlier worry entirely replaced by genuine joy at witnessing their sister's happiness. Edmund watched from a distance, with quiet, grateful pride, finally free of the guilt that had weighed so heavily upon him since his initial financial troubles first threatened his family's future. As the celebration eventually wound down and guests began departing into the cold winter evening, Eleanor stood beside her husband at the entrance of Ashford Hall, watching the last of their guests disappear down the long road home. Whatever debt had first brought them together now stood entirely forgiven, not merely in financial terms, but in the deeper sense that whatever difficult circumstances had once threatened to define their relationship had instead given way to something genuinely worth celebrating. "Welcome home, Duchess," Alistair said softly, using her new title for the first time, as they stood together in the doorway of what would now be her home as well. Eleanor smiled, genuine happiness settling comfortably within her as she looked toward the future, awaiting them both. "Thank you, Alistair. I could not imagine a more fitting beginning to whatever comes next for us, built as it is upon genuine trust rather than simple obligation alone." Together, they turned and walked back inside Ashford Hall, ready to face whatever future awaited them, as true partners, their unusual beginning having ultimately given way to a genuine, lasting happiness that neither had fully expected when this remarkable story first began.